They sold poison as medicine, mailed babies, and played with radiation. These insane things were 100% legal and real. It's hard to believe, but not too long ago, it was completely legal to send a child barely tall enough to reach a shovel deep into a coal mine. In late 19th and early 20th century America, coal mining wasn't just for rugged men with lanterns and pickaxes, it also relied on kids. Small, fast, and considered cheap labor, boys as young as 8 were hired to crawl through tight, dangerous tunnels. Their job? Pull coal carts, pick rocks from conveyor belts, or open and close ventilation doors underground for 10 hours straight. These children were called breaker boys and trappers. They worked surrounded by black dust so thick it stuck to their lungs and skin. Coal dust filled the air like fog, and explosions weren't uncommon. Miners called some shafts coffin mines, and yet this was a job passed down through families, just part of life. Parents often signed their kids up willingly because it was one of the few available ways to earn steady money in struggling communities. Photos from that era show children covered in soot, eyes barely open from exhaustion, standing next to carts taller than they were. And this wasn't just in one region. From Pennsylvania to West Virginia, coal towns thrived on these tiny workers. There were no federal rules, no inspections, no child labor protections. The law turned a blind eye. Many mining companies even built housing and schools near the pits, though school hours were a luxury most kids couldn't afford. In the 1910s, reformers like Lewis Hine began photographing these boys to shock the public. His images circulated in newspapers and magazines, stirring public outrage. It took decades of pressure before any real change happened. The Fair Labor Standards Act, which finally set a national minimum age for work in hazardous jobs, didn't come into force until much later. Back in 18th and 19th century England, getting a divorce wasn't just difficult, it was nearly impossible. It required an act of parliament, which meant money, influence, and time that most working-class families didn't have. So, some men came up with a workaround that sounds completely made up. But wasn't they sold their wives at public markets? Literally. With a rope tied around her neck, waist, or wrist, the woman was walked to a town square and auctioned off to the highest bidder, often with a crowd watching like it was a weekend fair. It was supposed to be symbolic, not cruel. The idea was that both parties agreed the man no longer wanted to be married, and the woman often already had a new partner lined up. In fact, some of these sales ended with a handshake, a pint of beer, and the woman happily walking away with her new husband. Authorities usually looked the other way. There were even cases where the new couple got official recognition, not punishment. This practice wasn't limited to small villages either. It happened in cities like London, Birmingham, and Leeds. Newspaper reports from the time described these sales in surprising detail, including how much the woman was bought for. Sometimes it was a few shillings. Other times it was more of a trade, like exchanging her for livestock or beer. Though it may sound shocking now, this was a kind of public performance rooted in frustration with the legal system. Eventually, laws began tightening and public opinion shifted. But for nearly a century, selling your wife with a rope in the market square wasn't just a joke, it was a real legal option. There was a time when flying meant clouds outside the window and clouds inside the cabin. For decades, smoking on airplanes wasn't just allowed, it was practically expected. Ashtrays were built into every seat. Flight attendants handed out free packs of cigarettes with meals. Even pilots smoked in the cockpit while cruising across the Atlantic. The idea of breathing recycled smoke for hours was simply normal. In the early jet age, lighting up mid-flight was part of the glamour. Flying was for the well-dressed, and so was smoking. Airlines even used tobacco brands in their advertisements. But by the 1970s, things started to change. Cabin crews and health experts raised concerns about the air quality on board. Passengers who didn't smoke were stuck inhaling a fog of secondhand smoke from takeoff to landing. Still, regulations were slow to come. It wasn't until the late 1980s that smoking bans were introduced, and only on short domestic flights at first. Long-haul and international flights? Still fair game. The shift didn't fully settle until the early 2000s, when smoking was finally banned from nearly every commercial flight worldwide. Today, most passengers don't even realize what that little no smoking sign used to mean. It's just always been off. But if you ever wondered why the ashtray is still there in some plane bathrooms, that's because legally there has to be one, just in case someone breaks the rule. A relic of an airborne era when lighting up at 30,000 feet was just part of the journey. In the late 19th century, one particular white powder had a sparkling reputation. Doctors, pharmacists, and even parents totally swore by it. It was mixed into everything from pain relief ointments to cough syrups. One of the most popular uses? Toothache drops. They promised fast relief, and yeah, they definitely delivered. Kids with sore gums were given medicine that numbed the pain instantly and, oddly enough, left them feeling pretty energized. At the same time, soft drinks were booming. Inventors were busy creating fizzy concoctions for pharmacies, marketing them as health tonics. And that's where Coca-Cola comes in. The original recipe, yes, the real one included coca leaf extract, which is a natural source of that same popular white powder. It gave the drink its name, its reputation, and, well, its signature kick. Back then, nobody thought this was weird. In fact, it was considered modern, even scientific. Ads described these substances as invigorating, stimulating, and just perfect for people feeling run down or overworked. It wasn't until decades later that researchers started linking long-term use to some pretty serious health problems. Coca-Cola quietly removed the coca element in the early 1900s, although some forms of coca extract are still legally used in flavor production, minus the substance itself. As for those toothache drops and energy elixirs, they disappeared once regulations finally caught up, leaving behind a legacy of glowing ads, wide eyes, and a soda that went from pharmacy tonic to global icon. Today, even getting behind the wheel for the first time means, paperwork, eye exams, and a road test that can make your palms sweat. But there was a time not that long ago when none of that was required. In the early 1900s, all across America, you could just buy a car, hop in, and take off. No license, no proof of age, no training. If you could reach the pedals and turn the wheel, that was good enough. Cars were still a novelty back then, and lawmakers just hadn't caught up with the chaos they could cause. Actually, the first traffic laws in the United States weren't even about licenses, they were about horses getting spooked by engines. By the 1910s, as cities filled with Model Ts and untrained drivers, accidents really skyrocketed. But enforcement? Still pretty minimal. Some states didn't even introduce driver's licenses until the 1950s. South Dakota, for example, held out until the late 50s, and even then, the test was optional. In those early days, driver education just wasn't a thing. Parents taught kids by, well, letting them loose on country roads. Cities were more like real-life bumper car arenas with no traffic signals and no standard signs. Insurance companies started ringing alarm bells, but change came slowly. There's even a famous case of a 13-year-old boy in the 1920s who drove his entire family across several states without raising a single eyebrow. Police waved at him as he passed. Why? Because there was no rule saying he couldn't. Some towns issued local permits, but honestly, they were more like receipts than actual licenses. You paid a small fee, got a stamped card, and that was it, official enough. It took decades and, unfortunately, a lot of rising fatalities before standardized testing, photo IDs, and age limits became the norm. What's now a rite of passage used to be as easy as buying a loaf of bread. And for a while, the open road really was open to anyone. Back in the 1700s and 1800s, if someone insulted your honor, there was actually a legal way to handle it by, shooting them at dawn. Dueling wasn't just some dramatic plot twist from a costume drama. It was real law in many parts of the world, especially in Europe and early America. And it came with rules: same type of weapon, equal ground, and witnesses. It was considered refined, a gentleman's way of saying, let's settle this ourselves. Politicians, poets, military leaders, even United States Vice President Aaron Burr took part. In fact, he famously dueled Alexander Hamilton in 1804, a moment that still echoes through history and, Broadway. Both men arrived with seconds and pistols, ready to do what the court system couldn't. It wasn't considered murder if both parties agreed and followed the dueling code. Dueling grounds were often just outside city limits to avoid legal trouble. Doctors were on standby, spectators came to watch. And although the idea sounds wild now, duels were taken seriously with elaborate etiquette, like choosing weapons and pacing steps. In some cultures, refusing to duel was actually seen as worse than losing. Over time, governments started clamping down, especially as these battles often ended in, permanent consequences. Still, dueling laws weren't fully removed from the books in some places until surprisingly recently. In Paraguay, it's technically still legal under certain conditions. The concept of settling things like a man? It once came with a very real countdown and a loaded pistol. Not that long ago, the line between justice and spectacle was razor thin. Public executions weren't hidden behind closed prison walls, they were front row events, complete with food vendors, musicians, and packed crowds. From England's gallows to France's guillotine, executions were treated as community happenings. People dressed up, brought their children, and claimed the best viewing spots as if it were a parade. In 19th century London, a major execution could draw tens of thousands of spectators. Some climbed rooftops, others sold souvenir pamphlets with dramatic headlines. In France, the guillotine was considered clean and efficient. Even as late as the 1930s, executions happened in full view of the public, just steps away from cafes and corner shops. The US wasn't much different. In 1936, a public hanging in Kentucky brought out over 20,000 people. Local newspapers printed the time and location like it was a sporting event. And it didn't end when the sentence was carried out. Some attendees stuck around to grab pieces of rope as grim keepsakes. Eventually, laws shifted and executions were moved out of sight. Privacy became the norm. But the fact that entire towns once gathered for these events shows how different public values were. What we now see as the most solemn act of justice was once something you packed a lunch to watch. In the mid-1900s, especially across traveling carnivals and daredevil shows, there was one act guaranteed to pull a crowd stunts performed by pregnant women. Yes, it really happened, and it was completely legal. These performances were advertised like thrilling headliners designed to shock and amaze. "The high-flying mother," one banner declared. It was part danger, part spectacle, and part marketing genius. Photos and posters from the time show women in circus outfits doing motorcycle jumps, tightrope walks, or standing atop cars racing through flaming hoops, all while visibly expecting. The audience reaction was always the same: gasps, cheers, and lines around the block. In some cases, the performers weren't just participating, they were the stars of the show, promoted on flyers and newspaper ads. There were no regulations stopping them. If anything, the attention these acts brought in was welcomed. Carnivals made big money, and these stunts sold tickets. Safety standards? Practically non-existent. And although the risk was real, the public fascination overrode the concern. It was the era of shock value and big banners, and these shows delivered exactly that. Today, the idea sounds unthinkable, like something from a satire or a wild movie subplot. But during that golden age of roadside entertainment, these stunts were just another part of the traveling thrill machine, and no one thought twice about it. When the US Postal Service introduced parcel post in the early 1910s, Americans quickly got creative. It didn't take long for someone to ask if I can send a sack of potatoes across state lines. Could I send my child? Turns out the answer was yes. At least for a brief, bizarre moment in history, you could legally mail a child as long as they weighed under the 50-pound limit. The most famous case happened in 1914, when a couple in Idaho mailed their young son to his grandmother's house. He wore a coat with stamps sewn onto it and was handed over to a postal carrier like any other package. The carrier didn't just drop him at the door, he personally delivered the child to Grandma, right on schedule. Newspapers covered it like a quirky story, and no one involved got in trouble. Other families followed. It was cheaper than buying a train ticket, and rural postmen were often neighbors anyway. These weren't boxes with holes poked in the top. The children usually sat in the mail car, accompanied by adults under full supervision. Still, it pushed the limits of what parcel meant. Eventually, the Postal Service realized things had gone a bit too far. By 1915, the Postmaster General had to officially ban the mailing of people, no matter how well-behaved they were. Today, it seems impossible, but back then it was just one more way the mailman delivered more than just letters. In today's world, driving under the influence means, flashing lights, strict penalties, and those public awareness campaigns we all see. But honestly, not that long ago, it was just another night on the road. For most of the 20th century, driving after drinking wasn't just common. It was actually completely legal in a lot of places. There were no breathalyzers, no legal limits, and no enforcement. In the 1950s and 60s, bar parking lots were packed. Folks would leave pubs and diners, climb behind the wheel, and cruise home without a second thought. Some even kept a flask in the glove box just in case. And when accidents happened, it was often brushed off as just bad luck or poor weather. Law enforcement usually had no tools to test anything, and honestly, many officers just looked the other way. It wasn't until the 1980s that the conversation really started to shift. Advocacy groups began pushing for laws that addressed what was actually happening on the roads. That's when things changed. Blood alcohol limits were introduced, sobriety checkpoints became legal, and education campaigns rolled out. But look, the shift didn't happen overnight. In fact, some states took years to implement consistent laws. Today, it's hard to even picture someone sipping behind the wheel with no consequences. But for decades, it was all just part of the drive. Seatbelts were optional, open containers were common. And unless something really serious happened, the law didn't say much. It was a different kind of road trip, one that rolled on for way too long without rules. In the heart of world fairs and museums, long before the age of ethical tourism or cultural sensitivity, there were these exhibits that honestly shocked no one at the time, but would horrify us today. They were called ethnological displays, but let's be real, what they really were just were human zoos. Entire villages were reconstructed to showcase people from Africa, Asia, or the Pacific Islands, placed behind fences and put on display like living museum pieces. Dressed in traditional clothing, asked to perform dances or daily routines, these individuals were shipped across continents and told to act natural in front of gawking crowds. Visitors would line up to stare, take photos, and compare notes. A lot of folks believed they were learning something, but what they were really witnessing was cultural exploitation dressed up as entertainment. The 1889 World's Fair in Paris included a full-scale replica of a native village populated by real people brought in from French colonies. In Germany, Karl Hagenbeck, the guy known for modernizing animal zoos, also managed one of the largest human exhibits, placing people in enclosures that mirrored jungle or savanna settings. Even the Bronx Zoo once featured a man from Central Africa in its primate house. The public saw these events as educational. Officials praised the realism. But as global understanding evolved, these displays faded, replaced by museums focused on artifacts, not people. Still, the photos and records remain, a stark reminder of a time when culture was caged and curiosity crossed every line. Long before safety labels, choking hazard warnings, or child-proof packaging, the toy aisle was honestly a wild place. Some of the most popular toys from the mid-20th century weren't just dangerous, they were truly risky. Take lawn darts, for example. These foot-long, steel-tipped projectiles were meant to be tossed across the yard toward plastic hoops. One wrong throw and, well, someone could end up in the emergency room. They were banned decades later, but not before causing thousands of injuries. Then there were dolls filled with asbestos. That soft, fluffy insulation inside cuddly toys? It was made from a fire-resistant material now known for its severe health risks. At the time, it was praised for its durability and safety, which is pretty ironic, considering its long-term effects. Toy companies advertised it proudly, totally unaware of what it could do over time. And the crown jewel of jaw-dropping childhood science? The Atomic Energy Lab. Sold in the early 1950s, this educational kit came with a Geiger counter, cloud chamber, and real uranium samples. Yup, actual radioactive materials. It promised kids a peek into atomic science and gave them a kit that wouldn't stand a chance under today's regulations. All of these products were sold legally, often with bright packaging and glowing reviews from parents and educators. Safety standards? Still in development. The toy industry was focused on thrills and innovation, and for a while that meant pushing boundaries way beyond what's allowed today. What's now banned, recalled, or kept in museums was once the hottest item on every holiday wish list. In the 1800s, if you wanted to show off wealth and taste, you covered your home in green. Not just any green, a deep, vivid hue that shimmered in gaslight. It was fashionable, elegant, and deadly. The secret behind that color? Arsenic. Chemists had discovered that combining copper and arsenic created a pigment so brilliant it became the color of choice for everything from dresses to curtains to nursery wallpaper. The problem? That beautiful pigment could release toxic particles, especially in damp or poorly ventilated spaces. People started falling mysteriously ill in rooms decorated with the trendy green. Headaches, rashes, and respiratory issues followed. Yet for years, doctors and manufacturers denied any connection. After all, how could something so stylish be harmful? It wasn't just wallpaper. Dresses, artificial flowers, even book covers used the same pigment. Some factory workers who handled the dye developed strange symptoms, and in a few high-profile cases, entire families suffered health problems without knowing why. Still, there were no regulations stopping its use. Eventually, suspicions mounted and studies began pointing directly to the arsenic-laced dye. But even then, removing it from the market took time. There was no formal ban, just a gradual fade as awareness grew. Today, collectors still come across books and wallpapers with that dangerous green shimmer, a beautiful design hiding a toxic past. In the 1940s and 50s, medicine took a sharp turn into territory that sounds more like a psychological thriller than actual history. Lobotomies, a procedure involving the severing of brain connections, were introduced as a cutting-edge solution to all kinds of emotional and behavioral conditions. But what started as a treatment for severe mental illness quickly expanded into something else, a quick fix for anxiety, stress, or simply not fitting in. And the people most often targeted? Women, especially housewives. Back then, if a woman was seen as too emotional, too withdrawn, too outspoken, or even just overwhelmed by the pressures of domestic life, doctors sometimes recommended this invasive procedure. It involved inserting a sharp instrument near the eye and disrupting key brain circuits. The goal was to calm the patient, but the results often left people dulled, distant, or disconnected. Still, it was legal, and at its peak, lobotomies were performed by the thousands in hospitals across the United States. One of the leading figures behind the movement even drove around the country in a van performing the procedure in clinics and mental institutions, like a traveling salesman of brain surgery. It was seen as progressive, endorsed by medical boards, and even earned a Nobel Prize. The troubling part is how loosely the definition of needing help was applied. A woman could be described as too nervous or uncooperative, and that alone might be enough. Husbands or family members sometimes signed the paperwork. Consent wasn't always clear, wasn't. The practice was treated as modern science, not something dangerous. By the 1960s, new medications began replacing these surgeries, and public opinion started to shift. The procedure faded from mainstream use not through a ban, but because it simply fell out of favor. But the fact that it was once legal, widespread, and even encouraged shows just how much medicine and society's view of women's behavior has changed. That's about it. Which of the currently legal things do you think will become illegal in the future? Write in the comments. For more useful information, watch other videos.